Welcome everyone to another edition of the Ask Bill Keegan Show. I know it's been a long time since I've been back here, but I really wanted to make sure that we had a meeting for this, an opportunity to discuss with you the warrant articles that have been presented at the meeting, which will be scheduled for October 1st at 7:30 at the high school. Always a good opportunity to have the input prior to the meeting so that everyone who's going to be attending that meeting will have the opportunity to have all the information presented to them beforehand before they get to the meeting. So I have a number of folks that are going to be joining me here today. First with Mike Johns. Mike Johns is the Veterans Agent, along with Paige Duncan, who is our Planning Director, Roger Hill, who was Director of Public Works, and Bill Euchner, who is the Business Manager for the School Department, and also Chairman of the School Building Committee. And finally, we'll have Chief Bill Baker, who will explain the last article, which is the canvassers and solicitors article. So with that, I'd like to just start with Article 1. While there's no presenter on that, it's a summary of the article. Is that this is an opportunity where we actually received an $810,000 grant from the federal government to buy a new ladder truck. That represents about a 95% reimbursement to the cost of the truck itself. The overall cost of the project is about $1,060,000 to purchase the vehicle and equip it. So we will actually need some additional money from our ambulance receipts fund, which is the fund that we typically use to fund new vehicles. This was something that we had been planning for to replace was our ladder truck, which is several years old, and it was approaching replacement time. But fortunately, our department was able to secure a significant grant in the amount of $810,000 from the federal government, which is truly unique in many ways, and we're very, very fortunate to be able to be the recipient of that. And so we're really glad that we have this opportunity to move this article forward at this time. So that's Article 1. The fire department will certainly answer any questions that anybody will have. The fire chief will be there, along, I'm sure, with some of the deputies, Mike Kelleher, and perhaps to talk about the grant itself. And Tom Buckley, the other deputy, will be there as well too. So I'm quite certain that we'll be able to answer any questions that may come up about that, but it's actually relatively simple in terms of the actual transaction itself. So Article 1 is primarily needed to provide the funding to purchase the vehicle and to equip the entire purchase. And so the entire article is worth a total of $1,060,000, $810,000 from the grant, and $250,000 from ambulance receipts. So that's Article 1. Article 2 deals with an article relative to public employees serving in the armed forces of the United States, which allows communities to pay public employees in the military services the difference between base salary and military pay. And he'll talk to me about this and talk to all of you about that topic is Veterans Agent Mike Johns. Mike, welcome to the show.
Bill, thanks for having me here today.
You want to talk a little bit about the article and why you brought this forward?
Certainly. This article is a local option, meaning that state legislature has provided this for public employees. So this article presents the opportunity for employers to pay the difference between the base salary to what their base military pay is when they're deployed. So for example, a state of Massachusetts employee, they would automatically get this when they deploy with the National Guard or the Reserve as an employee of the state of Massachusetts. A town of Foxboro employee is a little different. We as a town would have to adopt this local option for them to be able to have this. As in their employer, and we do have several, 3 currently, employees of the town of Foxboro who are members of the National Guard and Reserve. And this would allow them to continue to get the same pay that they're already getting when they go into deploy. For example, if someone was to be making $60,000 as a town of Foxboro employee, and they go and their pay with the military is $40,000, when they deploy, the town of Foxboro would continue their benefits, hold their job position, and pay that $20,000 delta so that their status of living or their quality of life remains, especially for those in the family who remain back here at home.
So one of the questions that came up during the advisory committee meetings was how many other communities do this and what other businesses do this, and you provide some information for the advisory committee on that topic. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I do have those numbers in front of me. So in my research, I have found 37 communities in Massachusetts that do provide this, this difference in pay to their employees, town employees. Looking through corporations, I've found 16 major corporations that do this for their employees as a matter of retaining good employees and showing the value that they place on the folks that are employed by them. Additionally, there are 7 states in the country, including Massachusetts, that have this law or a very similar law provided.
Great. So in terms of this article, has it been considered before by the town?
Yes, it has. So the first time it was considered was in 2012. And by the way, this is actually it was adopted by the legislature in 2003. So the first time the town of Foxboro ever looked at this was 2012. And this is one of the most, at that time, was one of the most heavily debated articles throughout the year and on town meeting floor at that annual town meeting. And it lost by a narrow margin.
And the impact to the town, if it were to be enacted today, would be what? And how much of a financial impact would it be to the town?
Sure. I looked at it with the 3 current employees, and right now, for the next couple of years, the maximum impact for a salary delta would be about $15,000. Okay. So,
not a significant impact in that regard, but yet, in terms of the quality of life of those serving the country, could be an important consideration for them being able to do that.
Absolutely, and that's the intent of this law, and that's the intention of my bringing this forward, is to give the voters the opportunity to look at this and decide, is the value that they're giving to their employees, does that outweigh the small price that they're paying for that limited amount of time?
Great. Thanks very much for that help, and thanks for bringing that article forward. Paige, we're going to turn to you. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So there are a number of zoning articles that are going to be considered at this next special town meeting. You want to talk a little bit about those? And the first one being to amend Section 9.22 of Chapter 275 of the Town of Foxboro's Code by adding School Street to the list of streets included in the Design Review District. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, to back up a little bit, I'm sure everybody's heard us talk about the fire station and funeral home project. Okay. And what that is, for those that don't know, is we're planning on, and we actually have an RFP out to sell that property, and we're envisioning a mixed-use development with some housing and hopefully a restaurant to complement the Merrill and Rodman Performing Arts Center. During the preparation of the RFP, when I was doing my zoning analysis, I noticed that School Street, which it runs from basically the old fire station down to Bay Colony. It's just that small stretch along the common, but I was shocked to see that that stretch is not included in our design review district. Okay. And what that is it's an extra layer of review. For a multifamily project or a non-residential project, anyone within the design review district when they come to the planning board, they also get reviewed by the design review committee. And they'll take an extra hard look at aesthetics, especially around the common where we're trying to preserve the community character. So when I didn't see School Street on there, I figured it was an omission, and I checked with the planning board and they agreed. So we are now proposing to have this School Street included on that list, which pretty much every other town around the uptown area is, every other street in the uptown area is included in that. So we feel that this is an important aspect, and especially as we're getting ready to hopefully turn over that property through sale, we want to make sure the town maintains some control so that we can protect the aesthetics across from the common.
Great, that's good action to take, and I appreciate the fact that you were able to find that during your review. We obviously want this to be a great project and sort of the start of a whole revitalization effort that's going to go on in the downtown that we're hoping for. We're all been planning and working so hard towards that effort. All right, so thanks for bringing that one forward. So Article 4 is to amend the Section 11 definitions of Chapter 275 of the Town of Foxborough Code. You want to talk about that particular article?
Sure. This came up, as you recall, we did some Route 1 zoning last spring, and brew pub was one of the uses we looked at. And in looking at the definition of brew pub after we did the Route 1 zoning, we realized that the definition that exists today, and I'm not going to read it, it's long, but basically it's a restaurant licensed by the United States Tobacco of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and it mentions under the farmers brewer statutes. So this was back in 2014. From what we've learned, we've had a couple people coming in talking to us about brew pubs, and we've learned that, as a lot of people probably know, the brewing industry, especially the small breweries, have really evolved. And since 2014 even, it's evolved at the state level through the legislature and changing of laws. The term farmers brewer statute doesn't mean much to me, probably doesn't mean much to you, but in that definition, there was a concern that that might preclude other classifications of brew pubs. So we've been working with town council, and we came up with a definition that just removes that specific mention to farmers brew statutes and just references Mass General laws a little more generally. But the key thing here is it maintains the primary use as a restaurant, and I believe that's something important in Foxborough right now. Is the original definition said a restaurant licensed, and this new definition says an establishment wherein the primary use is a restaurant. So we've kept that intent there.
Right.
So the use is allowed no matter what. I mean, our building commissioner has ruled that a brew pub would be allowed. So this is really a technical change to ensure that our definition is broad enough to meet the current regulations as they've been evolving since 2014.
So one of the things that has been discussed from time to time is the difference between a brew pub versus a brewery. And you know, it sounds like
Right.
there's not a lot of difference there, but there actually is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, getting in a little into legal jargon, but basically the brew pub, as I just mentioned, is primarily a restaurant. And they might brew as well, but their primary use is the restaurant use. We do have a use classification that exists today that would allow the brewery operation under a special permit. So that would not be allowed by right, and that would be something the planning board would look at. And that basically was also changed in 2014 to include bottling. So that basically is our sort of the manufacture process. So that would be separate. We do anticipate, a brew pub would have to come in and have some brewing capabilities, but the primary use would be the restaurant, not the brewery itself. Anything like at that level would have to be reviewed by the planning board under a special permit.
Great. All right, so that's really helpful information. Thanks for providing that for us. Article 5 is the next one, which is it looks like an acceptance of a new public way called King Philip Place.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. This is a project that was approved under subdivision control. We have a bunch of neighbors living out on that street. As you know, maybe folks don't know, but when a new road is built, houses may be built, and then once the houses are built, you put the final coat of pavement on it, and you finish it up, get the sidewalks and the curbing all set, and then at that point, the town will accept it. That's where we are in this project. There's residents out there. The road has now been completed. There's a couple punch list items that our engineering department will check before town meeting, but as of right now, everything looks good, and the benefit to this is it gets the road on the town's thing. We already plow it as it is, so we might as well get it in our roadway calculations, and it gives the residents, they now live on a town street instead of a private road controlled by a developer. So we feel that this, assuming everything is done and our town engineer signs off, we feel this is an easy yes for the town.
So what's really important about the calculation of the roads is that this figures into our Chapter 90 calculation. The Chapter 90 calculation is money that comes back to the town for funds that help support our local road maintenance program. And the more more mileage we can put onto that calculation, the more we can get back in terms of annual revenue from the state. So it's really important that we get that done. But the assurance that we had from the town engineer's office is that they will actually go out and check that road right up until the very last minute to make sure that the contractor has met all his obligations before that road gets accepted. And so they've said that they will advise us right up to the last minute, even before town meeting, that if those things are not met, they would actually move to table the item until those obligations have been resolved. So at this point, I'm going to take a break and come back with a few more articles to talk about. I want to thank both Paige and Mike for joining me to give us the updates on information on the articles that we just talked about, the zoning and for the veterans articles, and hopefully we'll continue to provide more good information on the next few as well. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, for this edition of the Ask Bill Keegan Show, and today we're covering the special town meeting warrant that is coming up on October 1st at the high school, starting at 7:30. And on the next few articles that we'd like to talk about is Article 6, which was actually a zoning article, but it requires explanation on the water side. And so therefore I've asked Roger Hill, Director of Public Works, to join us and to explain us how that particular zoning article will help us.
Thanks, Bill. This zoning article covers the area up along Mechanic Street, north of Station 1, which is right off Chestnut Street, and west of Mechanic Street. As everybody might know, we are building a new treatment facility there right now, and in the process of doing that, we were able to relocate some of the wells which have actually dropped off in production over the years, and we discovered a new source midway between two of the wells, about halfway between Chestnut Street and Beach Street. And that new source is a very good source. In developing these, the DEP requires us to look at the Zone 2s, which is a protection zone around the well. The Zone 1 is the primary protection zone. That's all around 500 feet of the well. And then when you go outside that, there's another zone called Zone 2, and the water that comes from Zone 2 ends up down in the aquifer. And then outside that, there's a third zone, which is Zone 3, and that's kind of a secondary protection zone. So when we moved this well up between Chestnut Street and Beach Street, it actually required us to expand the Zone 2 around that well, but it also got reduced up in the north side due to new aerial work that the state had done. So all this does is it changes the area, but it requires us to adopt a zoning article, which is a 2/3 vote at town meeting. Mm-hmm. And there's basically no change to anybody who lives in that zone. Mm-hmm. Whatever you're doing now is grandfathered in. Okay. However, if there's new business that comes in there that might be handling hazardous waste, or there's an existing building that handles hazardous waste, there can be no increase in the amount of hazardous waste that's allowed in Zone 2.
Okay.
Other than that, people don't get affected at all.
So it's basically a redefining of the zone because the wells have moved.
One of the wells.
One of the wells has moved,
Yes.
in simple terms.
Yes.
So this is something we need to do because of the new infrastructure that we're putting in place, and that it's really a protection for the wells as well as providing us the expanded capabilities of the water resource.
Right, and it brings in a dynamite new well.
Right.
That basically is around 1 million gallon a day producer if we need it.
Great.
So.
That's really helpful to know that. So thank you, Roger. Appreciate that update, and I'm sure I know this has already been reviewed through the advisory committee, and I'm not sure they have any more further concerns about it, but I think you provide a lot of good information on this topic. So thank you. Appreciate that. So turning to Article 7, which is actually probably one of the biggest articles for consideration at this next town meeting, is the article dealing with the borough school renovation and expansion. And here to join me today is Bill Euchner, who is our school business manager and also the chairman of the school building committee. And so welcome, Bill.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you again. Can you tell us a little bit about the project and why we're here and why this is important at this time?
Sure. The borough project itself has been in the minds of taxpayers for a number of years. We actually applied through the state for about 3 years trying to get it under the state grant program through the MSBA. Mm-hmm. In 2016, they approved us. and we started the process. We've been working on it since then to develop a plan that both meets the educational needs of that side of town's school as a local neighborhood school, which the town believes in. We have 3 of them. It is structurally, even though it's similar in age to the Taylor, it was from a physical plant point of view, in the worst shape of the schools that we had, so it was our next priority. The committee that is representing the town for this, the school building committee, is made up of the permanent building committee plus 8 other members, which you obviously are one of them, but it includes a pretty good cross-section between education with the superintendent, assistant superintendent, and principal of the school, as well as the finance director, and fire chief and a few other members. So we basically have a pretty good cross-section that's been working on this plan. It started with the development of an actual education plan, which is, because you're obviously building the building for that, not for the sake of building a building. It's the plan that we obviously use throughout the district, but it was what needs had to be changed in this building to make sure that we could not only meet the current education plan, but also what we anticipated for the years going forward. And also work with the MSBA because they have guidelines on what they anticipate on an elementary level, what the building should look like. And so that created some changes for us as well.
So the project, what's been educational for me as part of this committee is I've learned that, first of all, the committee is a great committee. They do a terrific job. The permanent building committee was the one that also just recently built the town hall. Project has been involved in the public safety building, was involved in the high school, the middle school, the library projects, all projects that have come in on budget, on time, and all projects that have collectively been extraordinary improvements for the community. So we really appreciate the hard work that committee puts in. But I think this particular project was great because as you look through it and I've seen follow the MSBA process, which is long. It's a long process. It's very deliberative process, which requires a lot of review steps along the way. But we can get a significant reimbursement towards the town for the cost of that project because of having that process. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there were a number of hurdles that we had to go through with the MSBA. They have funded every school project we've done in town. When we did the Ahern project back in 2000, they funded that. When we did the high school, they also funded that. So they're a good partner in that sense. From a point of financial sides, this is just under or just about a $34 million project. They will support us to a little over $14 million without contingency money being spent, and if we do spend the contingency money, up to maybe $15 million to do this process. So obviously it's a worthwhile endeavor to work with them because it cuts the cost for the town side down significantly. And you're right, it takes a lot more time because there's a lot more double checking on each part of the process. So you don't get to move forward until they're comfortable that you've done everything on your side to make sure that it's appropriately been approved and voted and supported.
So talk a little bit about the project itself and what it's actually going to do.
Sure. So some major changes to the project. We had noted originally that we knew we needed to make some changes to the pre-K part of the building, which is the upper left-hand corner. In the existing building, none of our buildings, our elementary schools, were ever built to have this pre-K concept. And the pre-K concept really is an early intervention program for students who've been isolated to have needs to make sure that when they do get to kindergarten, they are able to work with their peers on the same level. And it starts with a child anywhere from 2.5 years old up to just under 5 years. So one of the biggest parts there is obviously as you're dealing with that much younger grouping is that they have to be self-contained rooms. They have to have their own bathrooms, their own kind of kitchen type facilities for lunches and stuff like that. Because again, a 2.5-year-old is very different than a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old that might be in the elementary school. And so the space is very specific to that. So the space for this area was specifically designed for our pre-K program, which is a federally mandated program. The other large change is the gymnasium. The existing gymnasium, which is on the left side here, we were way undersized with our gym in this building. It was a 2,000 square foot gym wall to wall, basically. When they did activities internally, the out of bounds was always the wall. So it didn't meet the MSBA standards for what an elementary gym should be. And quite honestly, it didn't meet what we had in our other two school buildings either, on the elementary level, which were larger. The IGO has a considerably larger gym, almost a full-size gym, and the Taylor School has a gym that was probably about double the size of our one in the borough. So this is a just under 6,000 square foot gym with a stage on one end. As we've done with all of our buildings, we try to make sure that there's a feature within the building. Town Hall, we obviously have the Andrew Gala room, which basically is the Board of Selectmen's room to be used for meetings. Public can use that, and it's booked constantly.
Right.
So the gym would also be that. It gives another outlet for our youth sports to be able to run programs in it. And because the MSBA would not support auditoriums in elementary level schools, we chose to actually put a stage at the end of the gym so that we can actually use it as kind of a gymatorium, pull out the bleachers, put in chairs, and have a stage just like we'd have in any of the other buildings. Now, again, that's consistent with the way the Taylor is set up as well. It's a gym with a stage at the end. If we had tried to keep the auditorium, which was out of compliance from a handicap point of view, it would have been totally on the taxpayer's dollar. And it's an area that's only used a handful of times during the year. So,
Right.
you know, for a multi-million-dollar investment, we didn't feel that that was the right way to go. Where the MSBA will participate in this particular setup.
That's great.
And then what we've done is repurpose those two areas. In the core of the building, we now, instead of having the gym, we will have the art and music classrooms, and instead of having the auditorium, we'll have a media center and a computer lab, again, right in the middle of the building, where almost all the classrooms surround them, and where there are specials that people come to on a daily basis. It's a nice setup that way. We've also added a feature that we did at the Ahern, again in 2000, we were one of the first schools to do it, and that's what we call group spaces. And we've done that in each of the sections. So the kindergarten section has it, right? The first and second grade section has one, and the third and fourth grade. And what the group space does is it gives the flexibility for the teachers and groups of teachers working together to have breakout spaces for classrooms. So they can break a classroom into two segments and have two different groups working at the same time without interfering with each other. And it worked out extremely well at the middle school, and has. So it's a great feature for us to move forward with on the elementary level as well. And again, that's taking up some space. And obviously, all of the building will be brought up to ADA compliance, as well as security improvements throughout the building.
Excellent. So talk a little about the schedule. Once this gets approved, if the town meeting agrees with the approach that we're using, and probably should go back to the actual financing of the article this time.
Sure.
It's actually quite significant to note that we're proposing to pay for this project within the tax levy. We're not asking for a debt exclusion to pay for this project, which is in itself is significant. Do you want to talk a little about that?
This is, actually, we did the town hall the same way.
Right.
This will be the second project. It's probably one of the last ones we'll do for a while, because it does put an extreme amount of pressure on the budgets themselves.
Right.
But for the taxpayers, I think they're getting at least the satisfaction that their money is being spent within their tax dollar versus as an added cost through a debt exclusion or an override.
Correct.
So the other side of this is we have been planning, and that's why we have money in our capital stabilization, which will be partly used on this. It's $2.1 million will be used from there. We have money coming from the overlay surplus and a couple others. So we have about $4.1 million effectively in cash, if you will, that will be funding the project down. So we'll be borrowing just over $15 million on a 20-year note. And we'll be getting about, just under $15 million from the state, to compensate it. The other nice thing about the MSBA's program now is they pay up front. So once the project is completed, they'll be paying us as we're actually building the building. They hold a little bit at the end until the project is audited, and then they fully fund it. So you aren't borrowing that money to pay it over time as well.
One last point on the article itself, so folks aren't confused by that, is that one of the requirements of the MSBA process is that we have to borrow for the full amount of the project.
Correct.
So can you talk about that?
Yes, and it is a little, I think, disconcerting to taxpayers in general, but it's been consistent. This is the way it's always been done. And the reason for that is even though they are approving a grant amount, if your bids come in significantly lower, let's use that as an example,
Right.
then their amount also gets to get reduced. So what they don't want to have is a funding source that basically can be thrown into a disarray the second something changes in what your cost is. Obviously, we can't spend more than what the town approves. So if our bids were to come in higher, we'd have to come back to the town or do value engineering to reduce the project cost. So from that perspective, what the state has always said is you're funding the whole thing and you will offset that funding based on what we give you as a grant.
Great. So for those folks who have children going to the borough school or will be going to the borough school in the next several years, this timetable for this project to be completed is when?
It would be completed for September of 2021.
2021. So, so you can plan accordingly. If this project gets approved, we'll be into the next phase of preparing actual bid specifications and doing final layouts for everything on a much more detailed basis, and then bidding it out the project and getting into the next phase of this construction phase, which will be when? Construction would actually begin when?
We're looking for the end of October, November of 2019 to start the 2 additions, and then going through phases from that point forward to 2021.
So just a little bit longer than this time next year.
Correct.
We'll be looking at actual constructions beginning on this process. So there will be a little bit of, it'll be a little bit disruptive during that process because there'll be construction going on even while school is in session. And there'll be some folks being moved to different areas throughout that process. But it's all been planned, it's all been thought out, really well thought out. And I think to the credit of the committee, they've and to the MSBA has actually been very supportive of Foxboro's plans for this project, and actually noted that they've actually of all the projects they've looked at, they've actually found this to be the most well done and well laid out and well thought out. So we appreciate all the work that the committee's put into this.
And I think to your point on the phasing side of it, it's not the first time the town's done this. We did do it with the Ahern, we did do it with the high school.
Right.
We do realize it does create some disruptions, but we also can use it as a learning experience with parts of the things that will actually happen during the construction process for these children. And we just really look for the parents and the students to work with us to get this done.
And you know, we even experienced that even with the town hall projects, where construction was going on while we were still in the building. It's a little disruptive, but the end result is well worth the disruption that it goes through. So we, again, appreciate the efforts that go into doing that. So at this point, I want to take a break and come back with the final article discussion with Chief Bill Baker, who will talk us a little bit about the canvassers and solicitors article, and hopefully you'll stay with us and come right back. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, welcome to the Bill Keegan Show. Chief, I wanted to welcome you to the show today talk about Article 8. Article 8 is the motion to amend Chapter 184 of the General Code of the Town of Foxboro, peddling and soliciting, by deleting it in its entirety and replacing it with the language to read as follows. So, Chief, can you tell us a little bit about the background of this article and why we needed to do this?
Sure. So this is part of our continuing effort to try and clarify certain things that are unclear or ambiguous in the local bylaws. And maybe it would be helpful for people at the outset to understand what these 2 categories of people are that we're talking about. There are people called canvassers and solicitors, and the easiest way for people to understand that label is to think about door-to-door magazine salespeople, for example, are generally considered canvassers and solicitors, versus hawkers and peddlers, who are more typically food vendors, t-shirt vendors, the kind of people that move around in the area of a major event and hawk or peddle goods that they are otherwise licensed to sell. And so the reason that we did this is that when we looked at our ability to regulate this activity locally, and we looked at our application that we use for people coming into town wanting to do either of these things, we had kind of mixed the 2 regulatory schemes. And so even on the application and in the existing bylaw, we refer to peddlers and solicitors. So it took canvassers and solicitors, mixed them with half of hawkers and peddlers, and ended up with kind of a confusing regulatory scheme. And so the typical regulatory scheme and the typical approach to managing these things is that hawkers and peddlers are typically covered under state statute and then dealt with locally through selectmen regulations, whereas canvassers and solicitors are generally dealt with through a local bylaw. And so this bylaw is intended to try and clear up that ambiguity and separate these two regulatory schemes. So we will propose a canvasser and solicitor bylaw to deal with the door-to-door magazine sales type people, about whom we get a lot of calls from homeowners and residents in Foxboro, particularly if they show up after dark, knocking on the door uninvited to try and sell magazines, for example. And then the hawkers and peddlers, we will rely on the state regulatory system, and we will work with your administration and the selectmen to create selectmen regulations to clarify how we want to deal with hawkers and peddlers locally. So this bylaw is intended exclusively to deal with the category of canvassers and solicitors. And again, that's a group of people that we get a lot of calls about from residents who have people come uninvited to their door. So as part of this process and part of this cleaning up effort, we took on a few other challenges that exist in the current bylaw. So for example, there's an ambiguous phrase that the police chief is required to determine the morals and integrity of an applicant. It's an unclear, ambiguous phrase that doesn't have clear meaning in the law. And so we've substituted that issue with anybody convicted of a felony or anybody convicted within the last 5 years of a misdemeanor involving a property crime or personal injury. The goal would be to try and protect homeowners from people who have that kind of a criminal record and who might pose some risk to homeowners showing up uninvited at your house. The other thing that we've done is there were no time limits in the existing bylaw. And again, I think the majority of calls that we get are from homeowners who are aggrieved by someone showing up uninvited, particularly after dark, trying to sell them something that they don't want. And so what we've done is we've worked with town council to evaluate the most legally supportable and appropriate way to control the time that canvassers and solicitors might come to the neighborhoods. And the typical regulatory scheme is to say that they can do this between 9 o'clock in the morning and within 30 minutes of sunset. And what that does is it allows the time constraint to move throughout the course of the year. And so it's dark at 4:30 in the winter, which means that this canvasser and solicitor activity would have to cease by 4 or 4:30 in the winter months, but they would be allowed more leeway in the summer months when it's light out until 8 o'clock in the evening. And that generated some conversation amongst the department heads and others in town who looked at this, because there certainly were people who wanted to just limit the hours more significantly and make the window for canvassers and solicitors even smaller. But the fear is that it would not be supported by the Attorney General, who will have to review this bylaw. And so this seemed like the best compromise to prevent late afternoon canvassing by people. And then the last thing that we did, the last thing that we tried to clear up is that there are certain exceptions carved out under the canvasser and solicitor bylaw. And so it would exempt local charities, for example, sports organizations and things like that from this canvassing and soliciting bylaw. We added a category of political speech so that if you are involved in a political campaign, you would be exempted from this because your political speech would be protected under the Constitution.
So for the town meeting members who are going to be seeing this for the first time, most are seeing it for the first time, I think it's important to note that this was reviewed internally and was considered twice before to be brought before the town meeting for consideration, but we brought it back a couple times because we wanted to make sure that we had fully vetted it internally. Can you tell us a little bit about that process, Chief? Because I think it's important for people to know this really was looked at very seriously.
Sure. So I think the first thing that's important to know is this is part of an ongoing process, which we think is in the best interest of the taxpayer. So last year when we talked about the police getting ready to enforce the winter parking ban, we engaged in a review of the winter parking ban, and we found out we didn't have one. And that led to an internal review committee, and we put a winter parking ban bylaw on the warrant, and the voters approved it. Same is true with this. We recognize the ambiguity and the lack of clarity here, and so we got the department heads together, many of the people who are impacted in some way by this, and by impacted I mean people that deal with homeowners who call with complaints about this kind of stuff. So the Board of Health, for example, who regulate food trucks and other mobile vendors, our code enforcement office who deal with this, our planner, public safety personnel, including the fire department, and we consulted with town council to see what other communities were doing. And we put together a draft bylaw, circulated it for comment amongst that working group, met several times to make it as good as we could make it, made sure that it passed muster with legal counsel and was consistent with what other municipalities were doing. And then it was subjected further to extensive analysis and discussion with the AdCom, a group of people that play a critical role in this community, looking at budgets and proposals like this, who ask very good questions. And so what's before the town meeting is something that has been through this rigorous vetting process and hopefully is a good product.
I think that's really good to know too. This is the final article for consideration at the town meeting, which is scheduled for October 1st at the Foxboro High School, and it will begin at 7:30 p.m. We certainly hope that you'll be able to join us for that. I hope that you found this information helpful today, and that you will be able to this certainly answer some of your questions that you may have about the articles that we're going to be looking at. There are 8 articles in total, this being the last, but certainly not the least in terms of consideration. So I want to thank Chief Baker and all of my guests for joining me here today on the Ask Bill Keegan show. I hope to see you again next time.